The file was marked provisional when Velsoon first opened it, which was itself unusual. The Thesani archival system did not generally tolerate provisional classifications for longer than a standard rotation. Files were either complete or they were not yet files. But this one had been revised twice in 72 hours, and the notation at the top of the third revision read, in the flat procedural language of the Kaveth Fleet Intelligence Cooperative, human crew, status unresolved, assessment pending. Velsoon read that notation for a long time. The original entry had been simple. It had been, in the way of most original entries concerning newly contacted species, almost aggressively simple. The vessel had been identified as a deep survey craft, human manufacture, pre-treaty designation, operating without a sponsoring fleet authority inside a contested drift corridor that the Kaveth claimed by cartographic precedent going back 1100 standard years. The vessel had been intercepted. The vessel had been destroyed. The record listed 14 fatalities attributed to the initial hull breach, which placed survival at 91. The entry concluded with a label that Velsoon had written without particular care because the label had seemed obvious at the time: unsponsored biologicals, pre-treaty status, collection pending. It was the collection that had not gone as expected. The survey vessel had been a mid-size craft rated for long-duration mapping runs in uncharted corridor space. The Kaveth fleet record listed its class as civilian adjacent, lightly armored, equipped with survey instrumentation and standard emergency provisions. It was not a warship. It had not been flagged as a threat. The intercept had been a procedural action, the kind Kaveth Fleet Authority executed without formal escalation, the kind that filled a line in a duty log and was reviewed only if something unexpected followed. Something unexpected followed. 91 human crew members had survived the hull destruction. The ship's emergency systems had functioned, which was not unexpected. What was unexpected was what the survivors did in the first minutes after the breach. The Kaveth intercept vessel's sensor array had been watching, because watching was standard practice, because survival rates determined collection logistics, and collection logistics needed accurate numbers. What the sensors recorded was this: the 91 survivors did not drift. They assembled. Within 11 minutes of the vessel's destruction, the surviving crew had begun moving toward the largest remaining hull fragment, a section of the engine compartment roughly 14 meters across, still venting residual heat from the drive core. Within 22 minutes, the first jury-rigged shelter was in place. The engineering chief, a human designated in the ship's recovered manifest as Trey Hassan, had recognized the heat-retaining properties of the insulating panels lining the engine compartment wall, and had begun pulling them free and redistributing them, working in a suit rated for 96 hours of vacuum exposure in ambient temperatures of -190 degrees Celsius, with no external power supply and no tools beyond what he carried on his person. He had done this without being asked. Velsoon's first revision of the file had noted this behavior and filed it under anomalous crew coordination, a subcategory that existed in the Thesani archival taxonomy for species that demonstrated organized social behavior under duress. The subcategory had mostly been used for the Pallian hive-bonded collectives. It had never been applied to a species rated as individually organized rather than collectively instinctive. Velsoon had flagged it and moved on because the collection order was still pending, and the assumption was still that the 91 would comply once Dromath's crew made formal contact. Fleet Admiral Dromath had made formal contact at hour 14. The contact channel had been opened with standard Kaveth fleet protocol, which was itself a courtesy the protocol did not require for pre-treaty species. The communication had been translated by the fleet's xenolinguistics system into the dominant human language on record, and the content had been direct. The surviving crew of the destroyed vessel were to submit to collection present their identification credentials, and prepare for transfer to a processing vessel. Their status as unsponsored biologicals under pre-treaty designation meant they had no formal claim to resistance. The Admiral expected acknowledgement within one rotation of the local stellar body. He received an acknowledgement in 3 minutes. The senior surviving officer, identified as Vessel Commander Sarath Okafor, responded in measured formal language that the translation system rendered without distortion. Okafor acknowledged receipt of the collection order. He expressed that the crew understood their designation under Kaveth Fleet Protocol. He then stated, without raising his voice, that the crew would not be complying with the collection order and that they were prepared to discuss alternative terms. Dromath had not received a counterposition from a pre-treaty species before. He was not accustomed to it. The Kaveth fleet, in its 1100 years of corridor administration, had contacted 47 distinct species at pre-treaty status. 39 had complied immediately with collection. 6 had attempted flight. 2 had demonstrated organized resistance, and both of those had been species with existing military hardware and alliance frameworks to call on. An unsponsored biological crew floating in a debris field with 96-hour survival suits and improvised insulation had never before attempted a negotiating position. Dromath's response was to dismiss it. He described the crew's counterposition in a communication to his fleet council that Velsoon was later permitted to read as a stress response consistent with pre-treaty species behavioral profiles, likely to resolve within hours as environmental conditions degraded. Environmental conditions did not degrade. The shelter Trey had built held temperature. The crew organized into working rotations. Velsoon's sensor observations across the first 24 hours noted 5 behaviors that the archival system flagged without being able to categorize them cleanly. The first was structural. The crew maintained a complete chain of command without a functional command post. Okafor communicated through a relay system the crew had built from 3 separate emergency transceivers, and the 91 survivors organized into 7 working groups, each with a designated lead within the first 2 hours. No one had issued an organizational directive on the recovered signal. The structure had simply appeared. The second was acoustic. The sensor array's passive monitoring picked up intermittent sound transmission through the hull fragment, which was possible only because several crew members had grounded their suits against the metal directly. The sounds were not distress signals. They were not communication. The xenolinguistics system reviewed them and returned a classification of non-referential vocalization, patterned, possibly cultural. What the sensor array had recorded were 3 different humans on 3 separate occasions singing. Velsoon had spent some time with that notation. She had not encountered a species that sang in vacuum, grounded against a cold hull fragment in the aftermath of their vessel's destruction, before a collection order from a fleet that had destroyed their ship. She had not, in 14 years of archival work with pre-treaty and treaty species alike, encountered a species that apparently used music the way some species used structural redundancy as a load-bearing component of their group coherence rather than an ornament added when conditions were safe. The third behavior was the most difficult to categorize. At hour 19, one of the crew members had suffered a suit integrity warning, a seal breach at the left wrist, minor but requiring immediate attention. 3 other crew members had responded within 90 seconds. They had not simply assisted in the repair, they had positioned themselves as a windbreak, using their bodies to block the drift of microdebris while the repair was completed, in temperatures that the Kaveth medical baseline rated as unsurvivable without full external heating systems. They had held position for 11 minutes. When the repair was complete, one of them had touched the repaired crew member briefly on the shoulder before returning to their assigned work. The gesture had no functional content. The fourth behavior involved sleep. The crew slept in shifts, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that the shifts overlapped in a specific way. The handoff between resting crews always included a 10-minute period where both groups were simultaneously present. Velsoon could not determine the functional purpose of this overlap until she cross-referenced it with the communication logs and found that the overlap period was when crew members shared information from the previous rotation, not operational information only, personal updates, names of crew members who were managing well, names of crew members who were struggling. A junior navigator named Lis Oyen, who appeared in the communication logs more than any other individual crew member in the first 24 hours, always because someone else was mentioning her specifically, checking on her status, routing her toward the shelter's warmest position, leaving her a portion of emergency ration supply that was slightly larger than standard distribution. Velsoon noted this and filed it without immediate analysis. She returned to it later. The fifth behavior was Trey. Not his repair work, which was already in the file, but what he did between repair rotations. Every 4 to 6 hours, he would move to the outer edge of the engine compartment hull fragment and tap a repeating sequence against the metal with the flat of his gloved hand. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats. The sound carried through the hull and was audible on the passive sensor array as a low, rhythmic percussion. It did not match any distress code in the Xenolinguistics database. It was not a communication. It appeared to serve no structural purpose. Velsoon filed it under behavior, unexplained, and moved to the next entry. Dromath issued his escalation order at hour 48. If you have found this record useful, take a moment to indicate as much in whatever way your species' information systems permit before returning to this account. The record will continue. The escalation order authorized forced extraction. Under Kaveth Fleet Protocol, forced extraction of pre-treaty species was a standard measure for collection noncompliance, requiring only the Fleet Admiral's authorization and a notation in the duty log citing species designation and treaty status. There was no further procedural requirement. The 91 had been classified as unsponsored biologicals, pre-treaty status, and that classification carried no protective restrictions. Dromath communicated the escalation to Okafor directly, on the same channel as the original collection order. He stated that the crew's resistance was noted, that their designation as unsponsored biologicals, pre-treaty status placed them outside any formal protection framework, and that a boarding vessel would arrive at the debris field within 4 standard hours to complete collection by any means the situation required. Okafor responded in 9 seconds. He acknowledged the escalation. He stated that the crew understood the protocol being invoked. He said that his engineering chief had something to show the Fleet Admiral's boarding crew before they proceeded, and that the Fleet Admiral might find it informative. He provided no further detail. Velsoon, monitoring from the fleet's sensor array, watched the debris field for the next 4 hours with the specific attention she reserved for moments when her archival model was producing outputs it could not fully explain. Trey had spent those 4 hours preparing. His engineering training was in drive systems and thermal management, which meant he understood, in more precise terms than most of the surviving crew, exactly what the engine compartment insulation panels were capable of. The panels were rated for sustained exposure to drive core temperatures that exceeded most atmospheric ignition points. They were also, when arranged correctly around a venting heat source, capable of redirecting that heat with considerable control. The drive core was not functional. The vessel was destroyed. The core itself was not venting drive plasma. It was, however, still warm, a decommissioning-grade warm, a residual warmth that a drive engineer could read to within 15 degrees simply by the color of the frost patterns on the adjacent panels. He had 2 assistants. The first was a junior engineer named Devin Mara, who had been Trey's apprentice on the survey vessel for 9 months, and who had survived the hull breach because he had been in the engine compartment at the moment of intercept, and had been carried clear with the fragment when the rest of the vessel detached. Devin held the panels Trey was not currently positioning. He held them at the angles Trey indicated, and he did not put them down between positionings, because the act of releasing and regripping a panel in vacuum tripled the time required to set it. The second assistant was Liz Oyen. Trey had asked for her specifically. Okafor had relayed the request without comment. Liz arrived at the working area at the start of the second hour, and Trey gave her the calibration task, which was to read the frost pattern color on the adjacent panels at 15-minute intervals and report any change to him on the suit-to-suit channel. The calibration task did not require an engineer. It required someone whose attention would not waver across 4 sleepless hours in vacuum and who could read a color band against a 10-step Kelvin reference card without losing the count. Trey had chosen Liz because she was the youngest crew member on the working surface of the fragment, and because her assigned shelter position kept her closest to the engine compartment, and because, although Trey did not say this on any open channel, she needed work to do. Liz did the work. She reported color band shift at hour 2, and again at hour 2:40, and again at hour 3:15. Each report was 8 to 12 words, and she did not editorialize. Trey adjusted the array's geometry by small increments after each report. The array took shape in stages. The first stage was the structural frame, built from 4 full-length insulation panels positioned at right angles to the residual heat gradient. The second stage was the focusing geometry, built from 12 smaller panels arranged in a curve whose radius Trey had calculated by hand on the inside of his suit's wrist display. The third stage was the aim correction, which involved repositioning a single panel by approximately 9 centimeters every 20 minutes to compensate for the rotation of the debris field against the boarding vessel's projected approach vector. Trey did the aim correction himself. Devin did not have the spatial reference for it, and Liz, as Trey had explained on the open channel before he started, was on calibration. Dromath had spent his own 4 hours in the command deck of the Kaveth intercept vessel, surrounded by the staff officers his rank carried with him through any operational deployment. His operations adjutant, a Kaveth officer named Hurev San, had been with him for 19 years. His tactical analyst, a Kaveth officer named Leshev Kal, had been with him for 11. The two of them stood on either side of his command position and answered the questions he asked, which were not many. Dromath asked Hurev for the boarding vessel's projected approach time. Hurev gave it. Dromath asked Leshev for a probability assessment on the survival of any structural construction the crew might be attempting in the debris field, given the environmental conditions and their stated equipment loadout. Leshev gave a probability. The probability was below 12%. Dromath asked Leshev whether the probability accounted for engineering personnel rated at deep survey class. Leshev confirmed that it did. Dromath asked the probability question a second time, framed differently. He asked for the probability that any construction attempted in those conditions would be operationally meaningful at the moment of boarding. Leshev gave a probability of below 4%. Dromath accepted the answer and did not ask again. Hurev raised, on the second hour of the 4, a procedural concern. He noted that the crew's stated intent to demonstrate something to the boarding crew before extraction was not provided for in standard pre-treaty collection protocol, and that the protocol's silence on the matter created 2 possible procedural readings. The first reading was that the crew's stated intent was non-binding, and the boarding crew should proceed without acknowledging it. The second reading was that any demonstration offered prior to a formal extraction action carried evidentiary standing, in case the matter should later come before a fleet council. Hurev recommended the first reading. He recommended it without inflection, which was Hurev's way of recommending. Dromath registered the recommendation and did not select between the two readings. He told Hurev to instruct the boarding crew commander, an officer named Vesh Torin, to proceed with extraction on standard protocol and to log any demonstration the crew offered into the operational record without responding to it on channel. Hurev acknowledged the instruction. Leshev, third hour, raised a different concern. He noted that the sensor array's passive monitoring of the debris field was registering thermal output from the engine compartment fragment that was approximately 9% above the baseline expected for a drive core of that class at this duration post-destruction. He flagged the reading as potentially anomalous. Dromath asked whether the reading exceeded any threshold defined in the boarding crew's operational safety parameters. Leshev confirmed that it did not. Dromath instructed Leshev to continue monitoring and to flag any reading that did exceed those parameters. Leshev acknowledged the instruction. Neither officer raised the question that the sensor data implicitly raised, which was why a destroyed drive core in a debris field with no power supply was producing 9% above its baseline thermal output at the 72-hour mark. Both officers had served under Dromath long enough to understand that the question would be asked, if it became necessary, by Dromath himself. It was not asked. What Trey built in those 4 hours was a focusing array, not a weapon. The Kaveth boarding vessel's crew would later spend some time debating what to call it, because the vocabulary their protocol provided did not include an entry for a debris field thermal management system constructed by hand in vacuum at -190 degrees Celsius by a person who had not slept in 41 hours using only panels salvaged from a destroyed ship and the residual warmth of a dead drive core. It was not a weapon. It was a demonstration. Vesh Torin received Hurev's transmission relaying Dromath's instruction at the start of the boarding vessel's final approach run. Vesh was a Kaveth officer who had commanded extraction operations across 43 pre-treaty intercepts in his service career. None of those 43 had involved a stated counterposition from the targeted crew. 2 of them had involved jury-rigged structural work by survivors, both of which had been classified by the operations branch as defensive shelter, consistent with stress response. Vesh had himself authored the after-action analysis of one of the 2. He acknowledged Hurev's instruction and instructed his own boarding officers to log any observed demonstration without channel response. He made one additional notation in his personal duty log, which was within his discretion as boarding commander. The notation read, "Thermal signature elevated, source unverified, approach speed reduced to 0.7 standard." He did not transmit the notation to the command vessel. He kept it in the duty log, which was protocol. The boarding vessel arrived on schedule. The boarding crew's first transmission to the debris field was standard extraction protocol. Identify yourselves, state your crew count. Prepare to receive boarding personnel. Okafor responded with the crew count, 91 their designation, survey crew of the deep mapping vessel, and Trey's name, offered without explanation, followed by coordinates for where the boarding crew should direct their approach. The boarding crew directed their approach to the engine compartment fragment. What they found was this: 91 human crew members arranged in an orderly formation across and around the fragment in their survival suits in -190 degrees Celsius ambient after 72 hours in open vacuum on a debris field with no resupply. And among them, at the far edge of the engine compartment fragment, a thermal focusing array that was redirecting the drive core's residual warmth in a cone that the boarding vessel's instruments could measure precisely. The cone was directed at the boarding vessel's docking port. It was not enough heat to damage the vessel. A drive core's residual warmth was not plasma, and Trey had not made any claim that it was. It was approximately 40 degrees warmer than ambient vacuum at the point of focus, which was enough to be precisely, unambiguously measured and enough to demonstrate that it was aimed, that it had been aimed deliberately, and that a human engineer in a vacuum suit after 72 hours and 41 sleepless work hours had built the mechanism capable of aiming it. The boarding crew's commander requested a hold. Dromath's voice on the boarding channel was still controlled. He had not anticipated this specifically, but he had anticipated non-compliance, and he understood non-compliance. He instructed the boarding crew to proceed. The extraction was authorized. The focusing array was not a functional weapon under any classification his fleet protocol recognized. He repeated the designation: unsponsored biologicals, pre-treaty status. The boarding crew began their approach. Trey stepped forward to the edge of the focusing array. He did not address Dromath. He addressed the boarding crew's commander on the open channel in a voice that carried the particular flatness of someone who had spent 3 days in vacuum and was not interested in performing anything for anyone. "We built this in 3 days," Trey said. "Give us 3 weeks in a supply line." The boarding vessel stopped. The channel stayed open for a long time after that. Vel Soon, reading the sensor logs later, counted the time in the Thesani unit closest to a standard second and arrived at 47 of them in which no one spoke on any channel. The debris field was quiet. The focusing array held its direction. The 91 crew members held their formation. Trey stood at the edge of the array with his hand resting against the outer panel, not tapping, just resting. Then he began to tap. 3 beats. A pause. 3 beats. Vel Soon opened a new file. She had been an archivist for 14 years. She had filed records on 32 species at pre-treaty and treaty status both in the Kavath Fleet Intelligence Cooperative's jurisdiction. She had never before felt the need to begin a new file in the middle of a collection action, because collection actions did not generally produce information that her existing taxonomy could not accommodate. She opened the new file and sat with the empty entry space for longer than she had sat with any document in her professional career. She typed 4 words. They did not include the phrase unsponsored biologicals. The boarding vessel withdrew to standard observation distance. Dromath ordered it back on course twice before the boarding crew's commander replied that he was requesting a protocol review. A protocol review, under Kavath fleet law, required at minimum a pause in any contested extraction action and the consultation of a counselor-ranked authority. The boarding crew's commander cited specifically the classification uncertainty created by the crew's demonstrated technical capacity under extreme environmental conditions, and formally requested that Counselor Rath Oveen be convened. Dromath's reply to that request was not included in the file that Vel Soon was later permitted to review. She inferred from the gap in the record that it had not been collegial. Counselor Rath Oveen's chamber was on the administrative deck of the fleet's command vessel, and Vel Soon had been inside it 3 times before, always as a records reference, never as a participant. It was a large chamber by Kavath architectural standards, with tiered seating for delegate observers and a central floor that the counselor's desk occupied alone. When the session convened, 11 hours after the boarding vessel's withdrawal, Vel Soon was seated in the observer tier with her files, because Rath Oveen had specifically requested an archival record keeper present. Dromath sat at the floor-level address position. Okafor sat across from him, having been transported from the debris field to the command vessel for the session, still wearing the marks of 72 hours in a survival suit, the indentations of the helmet seal visible on his jaw, the fabric of his undersuit pressed flat in the specific way that spoke to a body that had been cold for a long time. Rath Oveen opened the session with the standard declaration. The record would be kept. The classifications were provisional pending the session's outcome, and the matter before the chamber was the status designation of the surviving crew of the destroyed survey vessel, currently classified as unsponsored biologicals, pre-treaty status. Okafor's expression did not change when the classification was read aloud. He had heard it before. Dromath presented his case with precision. The vessel had operated in a contested corridor without treaty authorization. The intercept had been procedurally correct. The collection order had been correctly issued under the species pre-treaty designation. The crew's resistance was non-compliant behavior by unsponsored biologicals, and while the engineering display in the debris field was noted, it did not alter the fundamental classification. Pre-treaty species had no standing to negotiate their own collection terms. The designation should be maintained. Collection should proceed. Rath Oveen listened to all of this with the particular patience of an authority who has already read the file. Then she asked Velsoon to read the archive into the record. Velsoon had been prepared for this and had spent the 11 hours before the session deciding what to include and what to exclude. She was an archivist. Her obligation was to the record's accuracy. She read the first entry, the vessel intercept, the hull breach, the 14 fatalities, the 91 survivors, the initial classification. She read the second entry, the shelter construction, the organizational structure that had emerged without directive, the work rotations, the thermal management. She read the observations from the first 72 hours without editorial comment, because the observations did not require editorial comment. She described the singing. She described the 11 minutes 3 crew members had spent as a windbreak in minus 190-degree ambient. She described the sleep shift handoffs and the communication logs in which crew members had tracked and reported on a junior navigator named Liz Oyen, whose sister was stationed at the colony the survey vessel had been mapping, who had not been told yet that the vessel was destroyed, and who could not be told until someone with authority to communicate on a secured colony contact channel gave the crew access to one. The chamber was quiet when Velsoon finished reading that entry. Velsoon read the thermal array observation. She read the measurements. She read the boarding crew commander's formal protocol review request and the classification uncertainty citation. She read her own new file entry, the 4 words she had typed in the archival workspace with the cursor still at the beginning of the line. She did not explain the 4 words. She simply read them into the record. The 4 words were species, assessment, requires, revision. Then she set the files down. She had never done anything in a Kavath Council session that was not reading from files. She was an archivist. She was not a delegate, and she was not an authority, and she was not a party to the matter before the chamber. She set the files down anyway, and she looked at Rath Oveen, and she said, in the formal Kavath register, that she had spoken for 14 years in service to the cooperative's record-keeping apparatus, that the crew in the debris field had maintained a child's hope for 3 days in vacuum that someone would eventually give them access to a communication channel so they could tell a young woman that her sister was still alive. The chamber was very quiet. Dromath said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that had lost the particular quality of institutional confidence it had carried through the entire session, that the classification was a procedural designation and not a reflection of the crew's personal circumstances. Rath Oveen said quietly that the classification was under review. The review took 4 hours. The outcome of the session was not, as Dromath had anticipated, a confirmation of the collection order. It was also not, as the crew might have hoped, a simple release. What Rath Oveen issued was a provisional reclassification, pending formal treaty processing, which removed the pre-treaty extraction authority from the collection order and established the crew's interim status as recognized contact subjects under the Kaveth Fleet's first contact protocols. The protocols were old and had not been invoked often, but they existed for precisely this: a species that had demonstrated organized social capacity, technical competence under documented extreme conditions, and a communication need that was personal rather than tactical. The crew would be transported, not to a processing vessel, to a station with full communication access and medical support. Okafor was returned to the debris field by shuttle to bring the crew aboard the transport himself. He was asked if he needed assistance communicating the situation to the crew. He said no. He asked if the transport had a communication channel with range to reach the colony in the survey corridor. The transport officer confirmed that it did. Okafor said that would be useful and left it at that. The crew boarded in the order they had organized themselves in the debris field, the working group leads first, counting their groups by name as they came up the ramp, and the engineering chief last. Trey came up the ramp and stopped at the top. He turned and looked at the engine compartment fragment still hanging in the dark, the thermal array still in position. The focusing cone dissipated now without the drive core's residual warmth to feed it. Just panels of insulation arranged in a careful geometry against the stars. He looked at it for 10 seconds. Then he went inside. Velsun filed her third revision before the transport left visual range. This revision was longer than the first two. It included the full observation record from the 72 hours in the debris field, the 5 categorized behaviors with her analysis of each, the thermal array's technical specifications as best she could reconstruct them from the sensor data, and a notation about the tapping rhythm that Trey had maintained throughout the collection period and had resumed in the final moments before the boarding vessel withdrew. She had not determined the meaning of the rhythm. She noted that it had not matched any distress code, any galactic standard communication protocol, or any signal taxonomy in the cooperative's reference database. She noted that it had appeared to be self-directed rather than transmissive, and that its function, insofar as she could determine, was to keep time. Not ship time, not suit time or countdown. Some other kind of time, interior and personal, that the rhythm marked in the dark. She wrote that it was the kind of thing a species does when it intends to last. The transport reached the station and the crew was transferred to medical. Liz was given access to the communication channel within the first hour. The conversation she had with her sister was private, and the record does not contain it. But 3 crew members who were within earshot of her position in the medical bay reported that it was brief, and that Liz's voice did not break until the very end, and that she was laughing by the time she closed the channel. The formal treaty processing that followed took 11 standard weeks. It was not a simple process. The Kaveth treaty apparatus had not processed a species at human developmental stage in 40 years, and the protocols required updating at several points. Rath Oveen presided over the processing council, and Velsun attended as the archival record keeper, as she had attended the original session. Dromath attended 2 of the 11 processing sessions and was silent at both. The treaty that emerged was a partnership framework rather than a conditional admission. The distinction mattered. Conditional admission placed the newer species in a subordinate review status. Partnership framework placed them in a lateral contact relationship with rights of approach, communication, and advocacy at the Fleet Council level. It had been extended to 6 species in 1,100 years of Kavath corridor administration. It was extended to humans in the 11th week of processing, ratified by Rath Ovine's signature, and entered into the formal record. The crew was offered passage on a Kavath allied vessel back to a human transit point. The crew accepted. Vel Soon was permitted to accompany the transport, which was unusual for an archivist, but Rath Ovine had approved it on the grounds that the record was not yet complete. This was technically accurate. On the first day of the transit, Vel Soon was in the ship's observation section when Trey came in and stood at the viewport for a while. He did not acknowledge her presence, which she had come to understand was not a discourtesy, but a kind of respect, a recognition that her presence was her own business and did not require narration. She watched him without looking directly at him, which the Thessani manage better than most species. After a while, he put his hand flat against the viewport surface and tapped. 3 beats. A pause. 3 beats. She did not ask him what it meant. She did not need to. She had spent 11 weeks with the record of a crew that had held itself together in minus 190 degrees in suits rated for 96 hours across 72 hours of open vacuum, by means that her archival taxonomy still could not fully account for. She had described the singing and the windbreak and the sleep shift handoffs and the way the crew's communication logs had circled protectively around a junior navigator's name. She had watched Trey build a thermal array from salvage panels and a dead drive core and demonstrate with 47 seconds of silence after a single sentence that the work spoke for itself. She understood now what the tapping was for. It was the same thing the singing was for. The same thing the windbreak had been for, in the sleep shift handoffs and the careful distribution of emergency rations toward the crew member who was carrying the most weight. It was not a signal aimed outward. It was a signal aimed inward, at the person tapping, at the crew who could feel it through the hull, a reminder, repeated in a rhythm simple enough to count in any conditions, that there was a next beat coming, and then another one after that, and then another, for as long as someone kept tapping. Vel Soon updated the file for the 4th time that evening. She noted the behavior. She noted its recurrence. She noted, in language that was not precisely the clinical register she had used for 14 years in the cooperative's service, that she had been present for the events described in this record and that her initial classification had been incomplete. She did not restate the initial classification. She did not need to. The record contained it. She wrote one final line and closed the file. In the Thessani archival system, a file closed with its final entry carries a status notation chosen by the archivist of record. The notation is brief. Most files are marked complete. Some are marked archived. Files of particular continuing relevance are marked active. Vel Soon marked this one pending further observation, which was the Thessani archival system's notation for a subject still in the field. Then, she went back to the observation section and stood at a different viewport and listened, through the hull of an Allied vessel crossing corridor space in the direction of a human transit point, to 3 beats and a pause and 3 beats, continuing in the dark.